Hello guys and welcome back. We are now into the stage where I'll be digitizing my piece that I've been doing all week, and if you haven't already checked out guys the picture that we have been drawing over this past 3 days, as now we're back to the normal routine of sketching on a Monday, inking on a Tuesday, and then on a Wednesday we'll colour that piece in, which we have done already, so definitely go and check that one out in the previous video, or you can check it out on my Instagram. My name is Blut084, BLUT084. Art and games here every day on YouTube, occasionally on Mixer, but every day and night over on Instagram. So if you guys want to check out anything else, just go and same name, different place on different medias. If you guys want me to join anything in the future for like gaming, as this weekend I'm opening up things for from my Xbox and also from my PlayStation. If you guys do want to join a VR game, or if you wish to join me in a GTA or something like that when I am doing the streams on Mixer, then don't forget you can contact me over on Instagram to let me know what games or where you have to be able to sort of join up and play games together, because I've got a couple guys and girls that play in the evenings with me, and some of those do appear on some of the videos, so definitely go and check out the other videos. Definitely on the GTA, there's Bodies Death than me, but that's enough of the gaming. We are all about the art today, and we are not doing a VART as we're not in VR, but we are using my PC and digitizing the piece that we did through the week, and because that one now is complete. We've done it on paper, it's now time to do it on the PC, and I might even move into the VR with some of these, but I think that would be a bit of a stretch, but I'll definitely check. Don't forget to check out the video or stream later and hit that subscribe button before you leave. Yeah, we're going to be colouring this in. I've already done a couple things to this afternoon before I started streaming. I put a few tabs up and put a few layers in, and I thought to myself, I can't do too much to this before anybody sort of sees me doing it, because I know you guys do like to watch what I do as I'm doing it, how I'm doing it. Again, this app that I'm using is completely free. If you guys want to purchase this, which again is completely free to purchase, you've just got to go online to wink purchase them. But they're not illegal. There's nothing wrong with them. They're actually out there for people like us that want to draw and learn how a digital medium without using the cost of the Photoshops, because Photoshop is a lot better than this, but that is because it's Photoshop, of course. This is like the poor man's Photoshop. You've got all the different tools. You can't see the tools at the moment, but you can in some of the other videos. If you want to see more of the tools and what they are, let me know, and I'll sort of do a little tutorial on what different tool does, but I'll be picking them as I go along, and sort of changing these things and making things look like they should do. And then maybe tomorrow I'll come back and put some shading in, because I don't think I'm going to get much time to put shading in today. I just want to get the main images like I have when I say ink, or if I'm sketching. This is kind of like the sketching stage for me, and then tomorrow we'll do some shading and background and different other good things, and I'll tidy a few things up. But yeah, we're going to be getting down as much as we can today, and we'll keep going. But as you can see in the top right hand corner, there is the thing that I've been listening to while I've been drawing this as well. It's all about mutants, but it's not all about mutants. They are called Comics Explained. They also have another channel called, or second channel, I think they live in the same house in fact. Their YouTube is also called Comic Historians, so definitely go check those out, guys. And this is who I normally listen to. If you ever join my other streams or things like that, this is who I listen to. So guys, yeah, hopefully you'll enjoy watching them as you enjoy me, as I enjoy drawing something for you. So yeah, guys, let's get going.
What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button, and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Alright, so continuing our videos on the X-Men chronology, which we need to get back on track with this. Remember, all this stuff comes after House of M, and this is kind of cool, because this is basically like the return of Apocalypse after the events of House of M. Now, Apocalypse has always been a really interesting villain. He's one of these characters that nobody ever really knows how to write, and the reason why is because from the time he was introduced, and over the years, especially in the 90s, and like the X-Factor stories with the original team and the X-Factor stories with the second team, the government-sanctioned team, Apocalypse was always one of these villains where it's like, if he chose to, he could eradicate the X-Men. He could just destroy them in their entirety. He's just that powerful. And so the question became, what do you do with a villain like that? Now, in truth, all that goes back to X-Factor issue number 4 or 5, when he made his first appearance by Louise Simonson and Walter Simonson. And he always used horsemen. And that was kind of the caveat that Marvel would introduce, but it was always kind of a skewed eye. Like, okay, Apocalypse sends out his horsemen, the X-Men or the X-Factor defeat the horsemen, so why doesn't Apocalypse step in instead of just leaving? Apocalypse just kind of takes off. And the way that Marvel worked to basically explain this was essentially say that Apocalypse believes in a social Darwinism. Apocalypse makes efforts to conquer the world because in his mind he believes that he's making people in the world stronger. And so if he has horsemen and if he sends those horsemen out and the X-Men defeat the horsemen, the X-Men have proven themselves worthy for the time and Apocalypse just leaves. That's kind of how Marvel managed to work that whole thing in terms of providing an answer of why Apocalypse doesn't just destroy all the X-Men. Now, there have been times where Apocalypse has made moves and jumped into different schemes that are outside of determining whether or not the X-Men are worthy, and it's for a specific goal. And like, it's taken the power of multiple groups, the Avengers, the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, X-Factor, so on and so forth, to like get him to go away. But one thing to bear in mind is really, as far as I'm aware, when it comes to the character of Apocalypse, he's never truly been defeated. He's just kind of been staved off. It's kind of been like, okay, I don't feel like dealing with this anymore, and then he just leaves. But the cool thing about this is that after the events of House of M, because 98% of the mutant population lost its powers, Apocalypse just woke up. Now remember, Apocalypse slumbers, right? Like he goes through like these 1,000 or 2,000 year slumbers where he'll just kind of stay dormant for a while. And it's a way for Marvel to kind of write him out and then just bring him back, 5 years or 10 years down the line whenever they want him to return. But he basically shows up here with this massive sphinx that he's built, of course modeled it after himself, alongside a character named Gazer. And Gazer was just one of these mutants out there that was pondering ending his life more or less. And the result was that he was basically taken by Apocalypse and he's going to be transformed into a horseman. Now this is one thing to keep in mind. Whenever Apocalypse turns someone into a horseman, he usually doesn't take individuals who lust for. There are people out there who want to be a horseman of Apocalypse, and he usually rejects them because what he wants is to basically grab a person who is deemed to basically be weak, whether they're weak in mind or spirit or they're weak physically. It's the idea that like he can push them and make them worthy by subjecting them to genetic modification, to brainwashing, and turning them into a horseman. So it's kind of like, I'm making you someone worthy, and then in turn you'll go forward and do my bidding. But at this point, we switch over to the Horseman of Pestilence. Now, of course, the whole role of Pestilence is to basically spread illnesses across the world. Now, depending on what era we're talking about, this can be done in different ways. Whenever Apocalypse chooses a person to become a horseman, he usually selects an individual whose powers will complement whatever role they're going to be playing. And so historically speaking, when a person became Pestilence, it was usually a mutant, sometimes a human, but usually a mutant that had the ability to basically kill things. With, they had like a death touch of sorts, or the ability to like spread disease or to make a person sick or something along those lines. That was the original Pestilence. In this instance, with the mutant population being so low, to be quite frank, the pickings are slim. That's really all it is. And it's kind of cool because in this instance, Pestilence is actually going to like various places around the world and grabbing all these different diseases, the bubonic plague and smallpox and things like that, just rallying all these illnesses that humanity would normally have a kind of cure for, and then in turn destroy the various cures that exist for those illnesses. So it's essentially having all these illnesses in his possession and no way to stop it. Now at this point, we jump back to Gazer, and again, this is the nature of becoming a horseman. For the most part, most horsemen are already like tried and proven in the sense that like they've been forged in the fires of combat, or they know how to fight, or whatever the case may be. But this goes all the way back to the original X-Factor story. The idea was that when Apocalypse first made the Horsemen, there was no real leadership among the Horsemen. It was just 4 horsemen. And so what he did is he had them all fight each other, and whoever won would be the leader. And it turned out to be Angel, or I guess Archangel, who was the Horseman Death, who became the leader of the Horsemen. The result is that in this instance, and because Apocalypse is basically in a rush, it's let's test these guys, let's see what they're worth. We're going to put their mettle to the test, essentially to see if one of them is going to become a horseman, and whoever wins, they're the one who will become the Horseman War. Of course, Ozymandias steps steps in and takes out one of the other guys and spares Gazer. Now, Ozymandias is of course the chronicler of Apocalypse. The only real role he serves is to essentially write down the whole life and times of Apocalypse. And so the result is that Ozymandias has really kind of become this scheming guy. Now, a lot of that goes into the origin of Ozymandias, which you're welcome to watch the video down in the description, which will give you the origin on his whole character. Suffice it to say, he was unwillingly forced into his position. And the result is that he's really been working over the millennia to try to find a way to like destroy Apocalypse and free himself from his imprisonment and possibly even replace Apocalypse. And so that's the whole basis behind his idea. The issue with this is that for Apocalypse himself, he has to find a new horseman, or at least find, the third horseman that he's looking for. And so what we end up doing is switching over to Sunfire. Now, this picks up out of an existing story that there really was no reason for us to cover, but it was basically an idea where Sunfire was, had kind of jumped into a conflict. He was double-crossed and he had his legs cut off by Lady Deathstrike, who was the one-time love interest of Wolverine, turned into a villain and having cyborg modifications. The reason why he's kind of in this infirmary is because his legs have been removed. But the idea with Sunfire is he's always been exceedingly proud, if not arrogant. Now, he had a huge empire under his belt, and that's why it was all really happening. That's why he kind of maintained that mindset. But the idea that he's now bedridden because he lost his legs is a pretty crushing blow, because in his mind, he's kind of like half the person he used to be. But the idea is that Apocalypse showing up on his doorstep and basically saying, hey, look, I recognize you lack faith in yourself now. I can give you the means to return yourself to who you were before. Sunfire almost leaps at the opportunity. The problem with this is that Sunfire knows who Apocalypse is. And when the devil makes deals, those deals always have caveats. And that's what this is about. It's really kind of this situation where Sunfire is like, yeah, you show up, this gift is too good to be true. There has to be something with it. But in the end, he ends up going with it. He ends up taking the offer that's provided to him by Apocalypse. And so what we end up doing is jumping back to the Xavier Mansion. Now, one thing I also want you guys to bear in mind, this takes place before the events of Deadly Genesis. And I'll throw this into that playlist before that story so that you guys don't really get confused in terms of where it's supposed to reside. But the idea is that Xavier hasn't returned yet. The issue with this is that Polaris has basically gone missing. Now, of course, Lorna Dane, the daughter of Magneto, or at least, it was believed she was the daughter of Magneto at this point in time, was a love interest of both Havoc and Bobby Drake. Havoc being the brother of Cyclops, Bobby Drake being Iceman. The issue with this is that while she wasn't really dating them at the same time, they've dated her at different points in time, and so they both have a romantic interest towards her. Now, at this moment, Havoc was the one who was believed to be romantically involved with her, but ultimately things kind of went awry, and she just sort of vanished, and that was about it. But the issue is that Apocalypse pops up on the scene, and suddenly people begin to panic. And the reason why is because, again, when Apocalypse shows up, your head turns, because that's when things are about to pop off. The guy can do all manner of things. He's one of the most powerful mutants to ever exist. And when the X-Men face off against Apocalypse, it's always preceded by the Horsemen, and then the question has to be asked, is this the day Apocalypse will kill us? And by all rights, he should be able to destroy them. The other half of this is that Apocalypse doesn't show up looking for battle. He shows up and says, I'm here to save you all. That what you guys are at right now, because of the fact that you guys are basically at 10% of the population that you used to have, you guys have proven yourselves worthy. Now, that's kind of the irony of it, because they had no hand in that. It was like a massive battle went on, and whatever 198 mutants survived would be the ones who would be allowed to keep their powers. They had them all stripped away by the Scarlet Witch. But Apocalypse deems them worthy. And that's kind of the thing to bear in mind with his character. When it comes to who's worthy and who's not, it's really just kind of left to his own devices. It's whoever he likes the most. It is cool, because when Apocalypse shows up, he basically says, I am planting the seeds of like plague and disease and illness, and like 90% of humanity is going to be destroyed. But what I have here is something that can keep you protected. The other half of this is that famine suddenly starts showing up. Now, of course, famine, like you would expect, basically has the ability to force people into believing that they're basically starving, that they're dehydrating, because they're exceedingly thirsty. And Apocalypse says, well, I have this drink here. One sip of this drink will quench any thirst you have. It'll satiate any hunger that you have. If you want it, all you have to do is pledge your loyalty to me. People just come flying at him. Some of them kind of stand back, and sure, they're struggling just like everybody else, and they believe they're starving just like everybody else, but they don't really give in. And those individuals who don't really give up are the ones who are experienced with this. We're like, look, this is the game that Apocalypse plays. This is how he does this. But for the most part, people don't care. They're just kind of like, whatever, this guy has the ability to satiate whatever hunger I have. I will do whatever it is he asks me to do if he gives me some measure of nourishment. So again, this is why he kind of shows up as a messiah of sorts. The issue is that in the middle of all this, we're suddenly met met by the arrival of Gambit, who effectively hands himself over to Apocalypse. Now again, we covered this in terms of like Gambit becoming the Horseman Death. So if you want to know what happens after this moment between, you know, what we're about to talk about here in a second and like this point where he shows up, that's covered in that particular comic. But it is kind of intriguing because Gambit's always been one of these guys who's kind of been on again, off again in X-Men and, you know, felt betrayed by the X-Men, but he always comes back. So there is a lot of loyalty to the X-Men there. And in fact, that's something that he says when he's being turned into a Horseman. I'm not doing this because I believe in your cause. I'm doing this because someone needs to keep you in check. But again, there's a lot of scheming and stuff going on here behind the scenes with Ozymandias. And this is kind of the funny moment because Ozymandias is talking to Apocalypse and he's basically saying, look, you should have just obliterated them. Like, why not destroy humanity? Like, why not wipe out humanity in its entirety? They're weak. And if they're weak and the weak don't deserve to live, then destroy the weak, destroy humanity. And where Apocalypse kind of counters with this and saying, you have no idea what's going on, Ozymandias' initial response is, well, you've grown weak over the years. And Apocalypse slams his head into a wall. And that's what I love so much about that, because he's like, I've had enough of your trash talk, man. Like, and that's what's so ironic is Apocalypse could just kill him. Apocalypse's belief system of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, only the strongest deserve to survive. It is both a platform by which he makes his case and his own prison. Will only the strong deserve to survive, and a person who's strong enough to kill me must be exceedingly strong. If I'm destroyed by this person, then that person deserves to destroy me. I deserve to die. Whereas he looks at this circumstance and it is, well, we can't destroy humanity because they have to prove themselves worthy. But life would be easier if humanity was obliterated off the face of the earth and all that was left is mutants. But again, with this whole idea of scheming, sneaking behind the scenes, all this cloak and dagger stuff, initially Ozymandias tries to strike a deal with War, simply showing up to Gazer and saying, look, man, I saved your life when you were Gazer so that you could become the Horseman you are now. I told you a debt would be owed. I'm asking you this favor. I need you to help me destroy Apocalypse. And initially, Gazer doesn't really offer an answer. War doesn't really tell him what direction he's going to go in. He just kind of shuffles around a bit. Now, this is something else I also want you guys to notice too. When it comes to characters in Marvel Comics, take like Franklin Richards, for example, exceedingly powerful. As powerful as they always are, Marvel always builds in caveats, or at least they try to. In this instance, there is a way to basically shut down the powers of Apocalypse. You have this guy named Pulse, who seemingly has the ability to do that. You know, Pulse has this ability to kind of take down Apocalypse's powers, even if it's only temporary, even if it's only for a short amount of time. The issue is that a being of that caliber, a being of that power, almost seems beyond Pulse's ability to basically take down on his own. And so, of course, he'll play the role, and he'll do whatever it is that he needs to do. But it is kind of cool, because it's like you trying to bench press 500 pounds, having never lifted weights before. And so, ultimately, we basically pick up with the idea that Sunfire is Famine, having made his arrival and, you know, forcing everybody to believe they're starving and so on and so forth. He'd basically been captured by the X-Men. And what this did is it allowed the X-Men to hold him in stasis, and then in turn decide how they were going to revert him back to being Sunfire. Because bear in mind, when a person becomes a Horseman, there are modifications, genetic modifications that are made to them. Sometimes they're given new powers and their old powers are wiped away. Sometimes their old powers are enhanced. Sometimes they have no powers and they're given powers. But when it comes to like believing that they're Horseman Death, or they're Horseman War, or Famine, or Pestilence, they're brainwashed into believing that. For the most part, it usually works depending on the character, but Marvel always builds that in as like a way to bring them back. When Wolverine became a Horseman Apocalypse, it took like, I think it was Jubilee or Kitty Pryde, I can never remember which one, but it was one of the two who basically showed up and said, look, like you have to come back, like you have to be one of us, remember who you are, and then he regained his mind, and that was really about it. But of course, Ozymandias shows up, basically sneaks into the X-Men mansion. You end up having War, who runs through Apocalypse, spills the beans about the traitorous nature of Ozymandias, and so Ozymandias says, look, I want to take down Apocalypse just as bad as you guys do. Our motivations for why we want to take him down are different, but we both want to take him down. He leads them inside the Sphinx through a secret passage, and when they arrive, Apocalypse is basically ready for them all. And that's what's so ironic. This moment right here, this moment when like Havoc shows up and Rogue shows up, should have been the destruction of these guys. Apocalypse should have just been like, nope, and then just wipes them all away, you know, and just obliterates them in their entirety, which he could. But instead, he's just like, I am not alone. Here are those who follow me as well as my horsemen. And it's just kind of like, okay, I mean, I guess that works. But then you also have him revealing the newest horseman of Gambit, the Horseman Death. And I'm going to say right now, he looks so amazing as the Horseman Death. I love how he's got the whole like, you know, like early 2000s goth, like I'm so misunderstood by the world, you know, the whole emo look. But initially Rogue tries to bring him back. And again, you know, the kind of inner turmoil that you deal with when it comes to these various individuals who end up being turned into horsemen, Rogue tries to bring him back by sort of building on that connection the two of them have shared over the years, the fact that they've been in love. It doesn't really work, not initially anyway, at least it doesn't seem like it. Instead, he just kind of continues this campaign to take on these various X-Men. Now, of course, this leads to the destruction of the Cure, which of course forces Apocalypse Apocalypse to kind of scrap the plans as they exist now and modify them a little bit. Apocalypse says, okay, fine, look, it's time to go. We got to get out of here. Like we'll go modify our plans. We'll worry about the X-Men later. For right now, we need to go focus on bigger things, on better things. And so what ends up happening is Apocalypse, alongside his horsemen, shows up at the United Nations and essentially makes this giant declaration to all of humanity. He basically says, look, here's what's going to happen. Only 10% of the mutant population is left. And so humanity will cull its population by 90%, meaning they'll eradicate 90% of their own population. You guys will be on an even keel. But it's kind of cool because he backs them into a corner. He says, right now, my horseman Pestilence has all these illnesses and diseases that are out there, and we'll unleash them across the world. Either you can sacrifice 90% of humanity, or I will wipe out 100% of humanity. The choice is yours, and you have a week to decide what you want to come up with. Now, this is kind of cool because logic would dictate you would wipe out 90% of humanity. Like you would say, okay, fine, we got to wipe out 90% and maintain the last 10%. It's utilitarianism. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. But when you're dealing with numbers that are almost that small, when there's a 10% difference between the many and the few, is there really a difference at all? Percentages make huge differences when it comes to like numbers and things like that. So it is kind of funny when you look at it from that perspective. But the fact remains here that what ends up happening is we end up switching over to Valerie Cooper meeting up with X-Men and Havoc. Now, of course, Valerie Cooper was at one point the liaison between the government-sanctioned X-Factor team and the federal government itself. And so she would pass information to them, and she would keep the government abreast of what X-Factor was doing, and they would usually get their missions from the federal government. And the result was that once Valerie basically left that position, she kind of went on to other things, but still worked alongside the government. In fact, she was originally part of Project Wide Awake, which was the government program to control and contain the mutant threat when it first started popping up. So she's been around for quite some time. But the idea here is that what they've basically been working on are like these more advanced versions of Sentinels, basically Sentinels that are still manned, that are controlled, so they don't have to worry about like a Days of Future Past event, but they are more capable of taking down more powerful threats. It's basically them just kind of stockpiling weapons and planning for like bigger and more dangerous things. And so what we end up doing is switching back over to Apocalypse in a conversation that he's having with Pestilence, only for us to find out that Pestilence is actually Polaris. That when she had gone missing, it's because Apocalypse had taken her and shanghaied her into becoming one of his horsemen, where she fought and she didn't want to have anything to do with it. Ultimately, she was press-ganged into it, and she's become a horseman this entire time. And so she's the one kind of operating behind the scenes. Now, the thing about this is that with Apocalypse, at the United Nations in New York, what we end up having is like the arrival of the Avengers and the X-Men, these massive superhero teams. But the Avengers aren't really there to like defeat Apocalypse. I mean, they're there to beat him if they can. But the whole idea is to try to like take him out, take out his various forces, take out his horsemen, which for the most part happens. Now, this is usually what goes on with Apocalypse in comics. His horsemen pop up, and by whatever manner and whatever means, the horsemen are systematically destroyed. And it's a way for Marvel to just kind of knock over the different pieces, remove the different pieces from the board, so they can wind the story down. And so in this instance, Apocalypse basically just kind of retreats. He just sort of says, okay, time to get while the getting's good. And that's one of the things about him, is usually whenever he leaves, he's always got a backup plan to bail out as fast as he can. Of course, Gambit's defeated, essentially knocked unconscious. Polaris is knocked unconscious, and so they're basically taken away. And so Apocalypse retreats to the core of the ship with the intention of just sacrificing himself and killing himself. And that's what's so important about this story, is because Apocalypse has never done that before. He's come very, very close to dying, but Apocalypse usually always escapes, sometimes by the skin of his teeth, sometimes because he just walks away and says enough is enough. But this is one of the first times, if not the first time, that he basically sacrificed himself and tried to die. And the reason why is because what we end up finding out is when Apocalypse was younger and he first encountered celestial technology, he didn't know how to use it. Now, largely that was all due to the fact that he was living in ancient Egypt. And so, I mean, if I went back there with a TV, he wouldn't know how to use it. But it was basically technology way beyond his ability to understand. Even right now in the Marvel Universe, for the most part, with the exception of like Reed Richards and maybe Tony Stark, celestial technology is way beyond anybody on Earth's ability to understand. It's, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years into the future in terms of how advanced it is and what it is that people can do with it. But what Apocalypse is given is basically all the information on how to access this technology and how to use this technology. So for those of you guys who are familiar with the Cable and Deadpool story, where we basically get the origin where like Cable jumps back in time and he basically fights Apocalypse, and then Apocalypse merges with celestial technology and then becomes uber powerful. This takes place right between that particular story. This one right here takes place between that Cable and Deadpool story, before that story happens. But when Apocalypse is basically, met with the arrival of the Celestials, they basically say, we'll teach you, like we'll give you all the information you need, we'll send it to you, like we'll beam it into your brain, and you'll know exactly how to use all of our technology, but there will be future payments. Now, this is where things are ambiguous, because we're not told what those future payments are. But because of the fact that this was is all part of X-Men Reload, which again was Marvel's way of basically getting rid of all these older characters or shuffling them around or taking them off the board or whatever the case may be. It was a way for Marvel to essentially remove Apocalypse, who had just kind of been a lingering villain for a couple decades, who just floated around from time to time. In all honesty, Marvel didn't really need to do that. It's not like Apocalypse showed up all the time. You know, he'd show up whenever. So I mean, if we didn't see him again for 20 years, fans would have been like, yeah, he was probably just sleeping, you know, whatever, and they would have just written it off that way. But Marvel decided to kind of take this story to basically remove him from the equation, and as far as I'm aware, the original intention was to actually kill him off so that we would never see him again, which of course didn't happen because he comes back later on. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like. I also do remember a lot of you guys really wanted to see the follow-up with that Nimrod story, where Nimrod comes back after the events of William Stryker waging war on the New Mutants. We can cover that if you guys are really interested in seeing that. Again, at this point, it's just kind of whatever it is that people are interested in that takes place before the Endangered Species event. We're kind of covering all the stuff that people might find interesting between those things. So anyway, guys, we're going to bring this to an end, and I will catch you all later. Peace.
Peace! Yeah, that's Comics Explained, guys. We're going to be watching some more in a second ago. This is waiting for that to load up. But it's all to do with mutants, and if you didn't know, we did mutant animals, which is what I'm doing now. I'm just sort of shading in and putting a few bit of fluffy bits. I'm trying to get a good picture and using the reference, as you can see from the drawing I did myself. Using different layers with different textured brushes, different things like that. Hopefully you'll see a difference and change as I go around. I'm going to have to get rid of that advert, guys.
Be quietly confident of a good night's sleep. Baby special.
What's going on, guys? This is Rob.
Yeah, guys.
Enjoying the content here on my channel.
I'm just doing some more, so hopefully you enjoy it. If you do, don't forget to leave a like. My name is Blut084. BLUT084.
So, as promised, we are covering Avengers Extinction, which is where Cable wrecks the Avengers. Now, here's the funny thing. This is actually the reason why Avengers vs. X-Men happened. This is the prelude to the whole Avengers vs. X-Men thing, which I didn't even realize it at the time. Like, when we did Avengers vs. X-Men, I didn't even think about that. I was like, man, this is a prelude for that, and it actually makes the story make a lot more sense. So if you read Avengers vs. X-Men and you were just kind of like, okay, this is weird, this actually really organizes it all. If you never saw Avengers vs. X-Men, you'll find my videos for that down in the description. But nonetheless, what this does is this initially picks up with a group called the Lethal Legion. Now, the Lethal Legion are totally irrelevant. They're like the non-Spider-Man version of the Sinister Six, right? Like the Sinister Six is like Spider-Man's most notable rogues who just kind of face off against him, and that's really it. The Lethal Legion is one of a multitude of different groups that exist out there to face off against various superheroes. For example, back in the 1960s, the X-Men had Factor 3. You have all these different, organizations and groups that face off against traditional superheroes. But what happens in the middle of all this is that where the Avengers initially pick up facing off against the Lethal Legion, suddenly Sam Wilson Falcon just vanishes. Now, this is kind of the crazy thing because he's immediately incapacitated, and that's the end of him. But right off the bat, we basically find out that the person that's behind all this is basically Cable. And this is kind of cool because what this does is this really follows up to the events of the whole post House of M landscape in Marvel Comics with the X-Men going into Messiah Complex, the Messiah War, and Uncanny X-Force and all those different things. Now, if you've read all this stuff, if you're familiar with the X-Men, bear with me for a second because there's a lot of people who are not. The idea here is that following House of M, when Scarlet Witch had basically wiped out 98% of the mutant population, or at least took their powers away, and then just kind of, left 198 mutants as the only one with any abilities left, what ended up happening is there was a girl who was born in Alaska, and nobody knew what her name was because her parents were killed when Reverend William Stryker attacked Alaska. Now, William Stryker is just this crazy guy who believes it's his mission from God to kill mutants, and he leads a group called the Purifiers, which are basically people that share the same mindset as him. But the idea here is that William Stryker had learned what was going on, the villain Mr. Sinister had learned what was going on and sent his marauders, and then the X-Men picked up the birth of Hope Summers, and they went to go investigate as well. The problem is that once all three groups got there, Hope Summers was nowhere to be found. Now, we ended up finding out that Cable had actually traveled to Alaska and rescued her immediately, or at least during the events of William Stryker's assault, and then took her into the future. The problem with this was that the mutant Bishop, who comes from future, very similar to the Days of Future Past, but we never learned what caused his future. It was basically revealed that this was due to Hope Summers wiping out 1 million humans in 6 seconds. It was like the 6-second war or something along those lines. And then Bishop started chasing after Cable in order to try to get Hope. that lasted all the way from like Messiah Complex all the way into Messiah War. It's literally the only thing that Cable was doing. He was just taking Hope into the future and raising her as his daughter. Now, of course, the reason she got the name Hope Summers is because she's basically the hope of mutant kind. She's the mutant Messiah. And then the last name Summers because that's Cable's last name. Now, the other half of this is that it focuses on the nature of Cable himself. Now, we don't have to get too deep into this. I'm assuming that most of you guys who are watching this video right now anyway, recently watched my Cable video. So all you really need to worry about, if you're not, really familiar with him, is that Cable is the son of Cyclops, and he's basically time displaced. He was thrown 4,000 years into the future and just raised there. So that's the only thing we really need to focus on to understand this video. But the idea here in terms of why Cable is back is not initially given to us. Instead, all that really happens is Captain America realizes that Sam Wilson's missing. He basically kind of follows the bird of Sam Wilson, Redwing, and then eventually tracks Sam Wilson down to where Cable is keeping Falcon held, after which the two of them basically engage in a conflict. Now here's the funny thing, and this is something to think about. Cable is able to easily overpower Captain America, and that's the funny thing about this, because Captain America is routinely demonstrated to us as one of the most notable fighters in Marvel Comics. But the idea here is that Cable completely incapacitates Captain America, and this is when we learn why it is that he's here. What we end up doing is we actually pick up with a character named Blacksmith. Now Blacksmith is a guy who was created by Jeff Loeb back in 1995 with X-Men Prime #1, but Blacksmith is basically just an ally of Cable from his own timeline. But what Blacksmith does is he tells Cable that after the events of Messiah War, Messiah Complex, and all that kind of stuff, when Hope Summers had come back to the present day, somewhere along the line, an event is going to take place that's going to basically lay waste to the future. And the reason why is because there will be a point when Hope Summers will be needed, but she won't be there. Now, the event that lays waste to the future is not what intrigues Cable. What intrigues Cable is that Hope Summers isn't there. And when the question is asked, why wasn't she there? The answer given by Blacksmith is, well, because she probably died. Now, that's what sets all this stuff in motion, because this is basically just a story where Cable travels back into the past and says, we have to find a way to deal with Hope. Now, just by following the Avengers vs. X-Men storyline to its most logical conclusion, what we know is that Cable was basically told by Blacksmith the events of Avengers vs. X-Men, that Hope Summers would become the Phoenix. The Avengers would fear the return of the Dark Phoenix, Jean Grey, more or less, that Hope would basically become a bad guy and potentially lay waste to the entire Earth. And so the Avengers wanted to keep her in custody. The X-Men wanted to keep her with them, which led to the two factions fighting one another. The indication here is that in the future that Cable's from, Hope Summers did not survive. She basically died. And the result was that Cable's going back in time to keep that from happening. Now here's the thing about this is because as Cable begins to go through the various resources and so on, kind of talking to Captain America, one of the things that's given to us here is that the Avengers were preparing for a war with the X-Men. What that war was going to be, we don't know. All we know is that somewhere along the line, the Avengers began to view the X-Men as a credible threat, and the result was that the Avengers began to stockpile arms and armament against them. Now, it's not as though the Avengers were going to go out and launch the first strike. They weren't going to run out there and just say, okay, so now we're ready for our war with the X-Men, let's bomb the Xavier Institute. That's not what the Avengers would do. Instead, they would wait for a time when the X-Men would strike, and that would make sense. I mean, even if it's not just the X-Men per se, one thing to keep in mind here is that with the events of House of M basically unfolding and the mutant population being reduced down to such a small number, Cyclops' tactics began to grow more and more extreme. He was basically trying to find a way to consolidate all mutants in existence directly under his authority. Not only that, he was looking at it as preserving the mutants. Anybody who came along and offered themselves as a credible threat to mutants was an no questions asked, no ifs, ands, or buts. That's just the way it was. That was the philosophy of the X-Men, really under Cyclops and Emma Frost during that time. That's why all this stuff eventually led, everything after the events of House of M was just this massive story that eventually led to Cyclops becoming a tried and true bad guy and basically becoming Magneto. With regards to this particular story, one thing to keep in mind is that Cable's from the future, and so what he had done alongside Blacksmith was basically stockpile all different kinds of technology and so on and so forth. The tube that Sam Wilson is currently stuck in is actually the Weapon X tube. It's the same tube that was used when Wolverine was undergoing the adamantium bonding process. The chair that Captain America is sitting in, that's the same chair that Magneto used back in the 1960s or 1970s when he basically began the process of trying to incapacitate the X-Men. He has Tony Stark's Iron Man armor that hasn't been invented yet. That's the danger of facing off against Cable. When you fight against Cable, you're not just fighting against a telepath and a telekinetic, you're fighting the future. future. If you're someone like Iron Man, you're fighting technology that you haven't made yet. And that's the great big thing about this, is because remember, Cable is as much a tactician as he is a guy who knows how to use various forms of technology at his disposal. Now, of course, this battle between himself and Iron Man leads directly into the water. And the funny thing about this is that Cable is basically fighting a conflict on two fronts. The first front is he's fighting against Iron Man. The second is that he's trying to keep this techno-organic virus from eating him alive. Remember, that's the nature of Cable. Cable, whenever it is that he has this techno-organic virus, basically converting his biological cells into machinery. A time will come when he will basically just be complete and total machinery. That'll be it. And it'll actually be in this story, which is really kind of cool. But the funny thing about this is that despite Tony Stark's best efforts, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. And the reason why is because of the fact that Cable knows every single one of Iron Man's tactics. Not only that, because of the fact that he's part machine, he can hack into all different kinds of machinery. Being that he's so advanced, Tony Stark has no way of protecting himself against the escapades of Cable, meaning Cable basically hacks into Iron Man's suit and essentially turns it against him, incapacitating him and throwing him in one of the chairs. Now this leads into the conflict of Red Hulk. And this is cool because Red Hulk is a foe that Cable has never faced off against. Cable's faced off against a version of the Red Hulk named General Talbot, but he's never faced off against the actual Red Hulk, General Thunderbolt Ross. And that's kind of the cool thing here because they're two distinctly different characters. Remember, we talked about all this when we did our run on Greg Pak's whole Incredible Hulk with Red Hulk and all that kind of stuff. You'll find that massive playlist down there. But Red Hulk is a combination of General Thunderbolt Ross's battle-hardened experience and his desire to defeat the Incredible Hulk, combined with all these powers that he has. The ability to just increase his heat as he gets angrier, his increased strength, his increased durability, so on and so forth. And the result is that with Cable facing off against Hulk, it's not as simple as just trying to beat the guy or trying to use his telepathy or his telekinesis. And in fact, Cable is pretty swiftly incapacitated. But what this does is it leads into Blacksmith, who basically jumps in on behalf of Cable. Now again, this is kind of a cool moment here. And the reason for that is because of the fact that for the most part, Red Hulk has Cable on the run. Cable's trying to keep this virus from eating him alive, but it's slowly and surely basically killing him off. Now the reason for this is because of the fact that once all this started, you know, in the beginning, back in the future when Cable was being told by Blacksmith everything that was going on, Blacksmith was basically like, by the way, you only have like 24 hours until the techno-organic virus eats you alive. Your telepathy is just not what it used to be. You're not going to be able to keep this virus at bay any longer. It's going to basically kill you. And that makes sense. And it's actually a pretty intelligent way to do things because it explains why it is that in older stories, like in the 1990s, Cable was so much more powerful than he is right now. Because if this story had been written back in the 90s, Cable would have made mincemeat out of these guys. It would have been child's play to take out Red Hulk and Captain America and Sam Wilson. It would not have been any effort whatsoever because he was just that powerful. But as he's progressed, his skill set, his abilities, they've just begun to decrease in terms of his ability to use them effectively. And the result is that what he actually ends up doing in a moment of panic is simply dispersing these talons up against Red Hulk and effectively infects him with a techno-organic virus. Once the techno-organic virus begins infecting a person, unless they're like some super high level, omega level telepath like Cable, they're not going to be able to keep it at bay. They're not going to be able to keep it off. It's going to absolutely ravage their body to the point where it's basically going to kill them. And so what ends up happening here is that in this moment, when Cable is essentially getting ready to kill Red Hulk, we're suddenly met with the arrival of Cyclops and Hope Summers. And of course, this was done by way of Blacksmith, just because of the fact that it was one thing for Cable to go back in time and say, I want to keep the Avengers from doing whatever it is they're going to do that's going to lead to the incapacitation of Hope Summers or her potential death. And it's another to go back in time and say, I'm going to kill the Avengers because their actions, their war against the X-Men is going to result in the death of Hope. It's a line that Blacksmith is not ready to cross. And the result is that he recruits the X-Men in order to defeat Cable. And that's kind of the funny thing about this, because this is where things begin to pop off. What we end up finding out here is that where the beginning of the story saw the Avengers fighting the Lethal Legion, the reason for this is because of the fact that all the members of the Lethal Legion were being taken to a prison, but Cable shot down the prison transport in order to serve as a distraction to begin kidnapping the various members of the Avengers. Now, initially, it was Wolverine who picked this up. It was Wolverine who figured out what was going on. And this makes sense because remember, Wolverine's been around for a long, long time. And And Wolverine has met and been allies and fought against Cable on a multitude of occasions. So when Wolverine, gathers the rest of the Avengers and basically begins bringing them in to face off against Cable, Wolverine realizes it's no joke. When Cable comes into the conflict, when Cable comes to fight, he plays for keeps. He does not play to take prisoners. And that's the coolest thing about this, is because Wolverine knows right off the bat, if it comes down to it, Cable will kill them all, and he will not ask any questions about it. And so Wolverine replies in kind by making the battle just as lethal. Now what this does is answer a question: can Wolverine cut through Cable's technological enhancements, or his arm, his metallic arm, and so on and so forth? Yes, he can easily cut through that. What ends up happening here is it actually leads to Hope Summers going through and freeing everybody, and in the process, Cable facing off against the Avengers and the X-Men at the same time. Now again, this is short-lived. It's a very, very small moment. But remember, Cable is a telepath, an Omega level telepath, and Omega level telekinetic, meaning he's of the highest order when it comes to being a telepath and telekinetic. The problem with this is that, again, the techno-organic virus is just ravaging his body. And so it gets to the point where he just simply can't fight anymore, and he effectively just gives out. But had that not been the case, he would absolutely wreck all of them. I mean, he would destroy them all. Now, what this did, or at least the purpose of this story, is it allowed Marvel to basically bring the character of Cable back without the whole issue of the techno-organic virus. This story was, in effect, a soft reboot for Cable. And the reason why is because once everything is all said and done, Hope Summers effectively cures him of the techno-organic virus. Now remember, this is not a new ability for Hope Summers. It's one of the things that was immediately introduced with her character. We all know that just because of the fact, or at least those of you who have read it, know that because of the character of Rogue. There was a story that had taken place with Rogue's character before the events of Messiah Complex, I think it was, where the Shi'ar had this thing called the Hecatomb, and it was basically this massive bomb that was empowered, or at least possessed by the spirits of just countless people who had died. There came a point where Rogue had touched it and absorbed just these countless minds into her head. It drove her absolutely bonkers, and she simply went into a catatonic state. Following the events of Messiah Complex, Mystique actually kidnapped Hope Summers as an infant, and then took Hope Summers' hand and touched it to Rogue and cured her of all these personalities, effectively resetting Rogue's powers back to zero. What also ends up happening here is that with Hope Summers touching Cable under the belief that perhaps Cable may be dying or that he is gone, what ends up happening is that in this moment of, emotional duress, she manifests as the Phoenix Force. And this is huge because Cyclops is the one that sees it happen. Now remember, just because a person manifests the Phoenix powers does not mean they are the tried and true Phoenix. This is a way that Marvel basically uses to say this person can become the Phoenix. That was the nature of the Avengers vs. X-Men story, is that eventually the Phoenix Force itself returned with the intention of bonding itself to Hope Summers. It's basically this idea that Hope sent out an SOS, or sent out a signal to the Phoenix, basically saying, I'm ready for the power that you possess, and the Phoenix showed up with the intention of giving her that power. Now what ends up happening here is that with Cable basically healing, this story basically comes to an end when Cable reaches out telepathically to Scott Summers and says, look, there's a war that's coming. The Phoenix Force will return, and when it does, it will try to bond itself to Hope Summers. When that threat is initially detected by the Avengers will respond by trying to take Hope Summers. What Cable says is, I want you to make me a promise from a father to a son that if anything happens to Hope Summers, you will do everything in your power to make sure that she stays protected, that she does not fall in the hands of the Avengers, that Hope Summers is allowed to step into her destiny as becoming the Phoenix. And so again, that's why the entirety of the Avengers vs. X-Men event happened, in truth, because of the fact that it was just Cyclops keeping a promise to his son. But with that being said, guys, I thought it was a pretty cool story. Cable just wrecking the entirety of the Avengers and the X-Men. It's one of the coolest things to see. It's one of my favorite moments when it comes to his character. But anyway, guys, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.
Quitting isn't easy, but Nicorette Quick Mist can help you finally quit for good. So you're not stopping, you're starting. Starting the new. Nicorette Quick Mist starts to relieve cravings in 30 seconds. Now in great tasting cool berry flavor. Nicorette, do something incredible.
Okay, so I was wanting to do like Matt Fraction's run of Iron Man that starts with Believe and goes through like the secret origin of Tony Stark and like the introduction of Arno Stark and different things like that. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that a lot of that comes out of Avengers vs. X-Men. And then the more I thought about Avengers vs. X-Men, the more I realized that a lot of stuff comes out of Avengers vs. X-Men. Really everything that leads up to like Secret Wars really comes out of Avengers vs. X-Men. A lot of the stories with characters that are just kind of, wrapping up or, loose ends, different things like that. But even within the story of Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, for example, the animosity between Black Panther and Namor the Submariner is rooted in Avengers vs. X-Men. And so because of that, I was like, well, I mean, it's 12 issues, we can just do it in 2 videos and then just call it a day. So I figured, why not do Avengers vs. X-Men? It's called Avengers vs. X-Men. So here's the deal. Really, a lot of this winds back all the way to House of M. Ego Raptor, if you see this video, hopefully this helps. For those of you guys who don't know, Ego Raptor, who's part of Game Grumps, had a big question about what to read after House of M with regards to the X-Men, and Marvel did not make it easy. I mean, they released like 7 different X-Men publications. It was stupid. But following the events of House of M, that story in and of itself was just designed for the purpose of really kind of reducing the mutant population. But what Marvel had under their belt after that were just like a litany of different stories that writers were creating. And all of this led up to Avengers vs. X-Men. And so there's like 4 main things, really, with regards to the X-Men themselves, because they're the main focus here. There's like 4 main things that come out of this story. The first is Cyclops, the second is Charles Xavier, the third is the mutant population, and the fourth is Hope Summers. So, starting with Hope, she's really kind of like the big picture character here. After House of M, the mutant population was down to like 198, and it was really designed for the purpose of just kind of offering some measure of a clean slate, which is to say, the mutant population had grown to be so huge and so unruly that Editor-in-Chief Joe Quesada was like, let's just reduce it down to an almost minuscule number, and then just kind of start over, focus on the core X-Men that we have, and then just kind of grow it organically from there. The problem is that there were so many events going on that Marvel never really had a chance to sit down and let the X-Men breathe. Instead, we got House of M, and then we were immediately followed by Civil War, where the X-Men were just hands off, and then we were immediately followed by Secret Invasion, and then Dark Reign, and then Siege, and then Fear itself, and there were just all these stories that were going on that Marvel never really had a chance to let the X-Men breathe properly because they had to constantly roll them over into these stories. And so no one could sit down and really do any great storytelling with the X-Men themselves. But there were a handful of stories that are important. There's really only 3 that are really significant with the character of Hope Summers. The first is Messiah Complex, the second is Messiah War, and the third is Second Coming. And with these 3 stories, what they did is they basically introduced the character of Hope. And Marvel had kind of teased this idea of, well, Hope Summers, she might be the next Jean Grey, that kind of thing. But the idea was that she would be the host of the Phoenix Force. But regardless of whether she was the host or not, she was going to be the way in which the new birth of mutants began to crop up. The problem is that never really happened. Marvel didn't do anything with her character. She just kind of sat on the back burner for years and years and years and years, and it got to the point that by the time Avengers vs. X-Men came around, people were just like, why is Hope Summers still here? Now, with regards to Cyclops, his character had become more and more extreme over the years, and the reason why was because, again, coming out of House of M, Charles Xavier was gone. Nobody knew where he went to. The Scarlet Witch said no more mutants, reality returned to a state of normalcy, minus the mutant population, being as large as it was, and Charles Xavier had vanished. And so in his absence, Cyclops and Emma Frost took over control of the X-Men. Now, Professor X did come back in a story called X-Men Deadly Genesis, and that introduced like Vulcan, the third Summers brothers, so on and so forth. But it introduced a lot of the actions that Charles Xavier had done that he had kept hidden over the years, and the result was that Cyclops and Emma Frost more or less lost faith in him. And so they literally would not allow him to be leader of the X-Men. Instead, they took over and they said, you can be an advisor, and that's it. And so Xavier just kind of sat on the back burner, and that was really it. And again, the other part of this being the mutant population, with it being so small, the idea was to bring it back somewhere along the line to begin regrowing, or I guess, restoring the mutant population. And so with Avengers vs. X-Men, this really does a lot of that, especially once we get to the end, with regards to Charles Xavier, the Phoenix Force, that kind of a thing. But the crazy thing about this is that the arrival of the Phoenix Force, it really comes with the arrival of Nova, of Sam Alexander. Now, the crazy thing about this is, I want to say there was a Marvel Infinite comic, which is basically like a digital-only series, and it was really just like Sam Alexander trying to outrun the Phoenix Force as it was making its way back to Earth in order to warn the Avengers, really the superhero community, of what was going to happen. And ultimately, nobody could really, he wasn't able to make it in time, and the Phoenix more or less just kind of makes its presence known. Now, with regards to like Tony Stark and Captain America becoming aware of the fact that the Phoenix returning. This is huge. And the reason why is because in the eyes of them, as well as virtually anybody else who was there when Jean Grey was the Phoenix, their first thought is whoever the host of the Phoenix Force is going to be is going to go awry. Now, through their own studies, through their involvement with the X-Men and so on, they know the host of the Phoenix is going to be Hope Summers. And therein lies the crux of Avengers versus X-Men. It's really just a battle for Hope Summers. It's making her as important as she's ever going to be in the line of Marvel Comics. But with regards to their stance on the Phoenix, for those of you guys who aren't really familiar with this idea in Marvel Comics, the way it originally played out is that Jean Grey was a character that just no one really cared about in the original X-Men comics. She was quite literally the quintessential damsel in distress. She could never, get through training sessions on her own. Cyclops always had to rescue her. The team always had to step in to save her life because she just never do anything worthwhile. When Chris Claremont took over the X-Men, he was like, that depiction of that character sucks. We're going to make her cool. And so because of that, they introduced the Phoenix Force. Jean Grey became the Phoenix, which gave her just these godlike powers. But the idea was the longer the Phoenix posed as Jean Grey, the more the Phoenix began to experience emotions, anger, rage, love, all that kind of good stuff. And so because of that, the Phoenix became corrupted by emotion, and in doing so, became the Dark Phoenix. And so because she was the Dark Phoenix, Jean, or I guess the Phoenix posing as Jean, presented a credible threat to not just Earth, but the universe as a whole. Because remember, the Phoenix Force represents the sum total of all life that has and will ever exist in the Marvel multiverse. Not just the universe, but the multiverse. There's only one Phoenix Force throughout the multiverse. The Phoenix Force will have avatars, like the Phoenix can break itself off into pieces, and then one piece can appear in the Ultimate Universe, and one piece can appear in the main Marvel Universe, and one piece can appear in another universe, and different things like that. But there's only ever one Phoenix Force. And so because of this, with Hope being so young and being so inexperienced, the initial concern of Captain America and the Avengers is that if the Phoenix takes over her, she's going to become the Dark Phoenix. It'll be the whole Jean Grey saga all over again, and it's going to lead to absolute pandemonium. Now, the other half of this equation is Cyclops himself. Now, of course, Cyclops here, when the Avengers show up and the Avengers confront him, it's really kind of a funny scenario because on the whole, it's just the X-Men against the Avengers, and really in the initial skirmish of all this, and once we actually get to about the midway point is when things start to change. But notice here, you have guys like Magneto, you have guys like Namor the Submariner. The reason why they're here is because of the fact that during the events of Dark Reign, which followed Secret Invasion, when Tony Stark was kicked out as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Norman Osborn was put in his place, Norman Osborn started implementing a campaign of world domination, or really kind of dominating the United States and then intending to dominate the world. But he created groups like the Dark Avengers, like the Dark X-Men, different things like that, which were basically villainous versions of popular superhero teams. But the idea was that the X-Men would not play ball with Norman Osborn. And because Norman only had control of the continental United States, they left the continental United States and went to an island they called Utopia. And so because of this, the X-Men were joined by Namor the Submariner, who is part mutant and rallied himself to his cause, alongside Magneto and a handful of others who just saw Cyclops as a legitimate leader of the X-Men, and were basically just kind of banding together because there were so few of them left. It's really just circumstance that kind of brought them all together. But the fact remains here, that's the reason why they're here. But with the X-Men showing up, Cyclops' stance is that there's only 200 of them left, and Hope Summers may be the key to returning the mutant population back to where it should be. That is to say, a whole new birth of mutants across the world. And so in Cyclops' mind, he's not the bad guy here. That's the crazy thing. He's the good guy fighting on behalf of mutants who have yet to be born, who have yet to gain their powers, to have their X genes activated or their X genes given to them and then activated. So, of course, this leads to the most logical scenario when the Avengers and the X-Men just start fighting one another. Now, in truth, there's really not a lot to be had here in terms of discussion. I mean, it's kind of cool to see, to see these guys going against one another. But the ultimate goal is to get Hope Summers out of there, to get Hope Summers to a different location so that she can be held safe away from the prying eyes of the Avengers themselves and the safety of the X-Men. But this is really Marvel just kind of showcasing the different abilities of the people who are here. I mean, the abilities of Spider-Man going against some of the X-Men, so on and so forth. But it's also the idea that certain people have to choose sides, namely Wolverine. Because remember, following the Avengers Disassembled story, Wolverine was rolled over into the new Avengers team as it was formed by Captain America, Iron Man, alongside Spider-Man and a handful of others. And so at this particular point in his character's chronology, because this takes place before the death of Wolverine, he serves as both an Avenger and an X-Man. And so he's just kind of having to pick a side. Now, the funny thing about this is that Marvel plays it pretty fast and loose with his character and has him walk both lines. The closer the Phoenix Force gets to Earth, the more in tune Hope Summers becomes with the Phoenix Force's power. And so in a lot of ways, Wolverine, having been in love with Jean Grey, sees very much of her in Hope Summers, especially the kind of power she possesses, the emotions she displays, that they get the better of her from time to time. And so where Hope Summers basically just kind of incapacitates everyone who's guarding her and races off, the other half of this is that another Avengers team has been sent into space in order to try to confront and stop the Phoenix Force before it gets to Earth. Now again, this is an impossible task. The Phoenix Force is just wildly powerful. It's way too strong. In fact, the Phoenix Force is so powerful that Marvel has yet to define an actual power set for the Phoenix. The Phoenix just has the ability to do whatever the host wants to do at any particular point in time. That's basically the power of the Phoenix. I mean, the only real description we have was given to us in Grant Morrison's New X-Men, I think it was. New X-Men, where it was just like the Phoenix just heals universes or just like fixes problems, quote unquote. That's all it does. Like, it just does whatever it needs to do. And so it just has omniversal power. It's insane what it is capable of. And so the idea of the Avengers trying to stop it is absolute nonsense. But at the end of the day, where Hope Summers basically goes on the run, Wolverine actually catches up to her and serves the purpose of essentially helping her achieve her goal, which is to get to the moon and then in turn access the Phoenix Force. Now again, the funny thing about this is the idea that Wolverine's kind of picking and choosing his allegiances. I mean, this initially came out of a fight between him and Captain America, you know, where Captain America is beating the absolute hell out of Wolverine, Wolverine's beating the absolute hell out of Captain America. It's kind of ironic that it's a pretty close fight, because you wouldn't expect it to be, especially with, you know, Wolverine's training in all these different forms of martial arts. And so because of that, it's kind of funny to see this event unfold. But when Wolverine's effectively cast out, he tracks down Hope Summers and then helps her to get to the moon. Now, of course, with regards to this fight against the Phoenix, it's really like this last man standing with Thor. Thor is really like the last of the Avengers in space. Now, the other Avengers aren't dead. I mean, they're very much alive. It's just they can't fight anymore because they've more or less been incapacitated. But the funny thing about this is that it's Marvel showing us where the Phoenix Force stands in relation to a lot of the heroes that are out there. Because remember, for a lot of people, Avengers vs. X-Men was their first exposure to the Phoenix Force. They'd never read like Phoenix Endsong, you know, they'd never read any of the Jean Grey saga under Chris Claremont. I mean, they never read any of that stuff. They've read about it online, but they never actually read the stories. And so because of that, seeing the Phoenix in full force is kind of interesting. But something that I want to point out here is that as far as this story goes, Matt Fraction had really kind of like nerfed the Phoenix. Like, he'd made it pretty weak in comparison to how it's actually supposed to be. I mean, you're talking about a multiversal force of pure omnipotence. I mean, it is virtually unstoppable. And so the kind of things that we'll see playing out here is kind of ironic, because a person in full capacity of the Phoenix Force, which is to say the White Phoenix of the Crown, can warp reality on a universal and multiversal scale. They could just reform anything as they wanted to be. Which kind of begs the question, where does the Phoenix reside in terms of all the powerful entities that are out there? And that's a video for another time. We did that once before, but we kind of have to change things up since new characters have been introduced and different things like that. But the fact remains here that with regards to the Avengers trying to track down Hope Summers, trying to find her location, all of them basically deduce the fact that she's heading to the moon, you know, where Wolverine's basically helping her get to an advanced idea mechanics tech station and then basically use a shuttle in order to get to the moon. Once they get there, this is kind of like this major conflict, this final battle that takes place. And the crazy thing about this is that it's like this last stand at the Alamo. It's this last attempt to try to end the Phoenix. Now, the other half of this is Tony Stark himself. Now, once we get into Iron Man Believe, Matt Fraction's run, this is the point that they're basically talking about when it comes to his actions in destroying the Phoenix. This is really kind of what the what that race, I can't remember what they were called, but what that race is referring to. Stark basically manufactures or develops a massive suit designed for the purpose of effectively destroying the Phoenix Force's life entity. But even then, that's why I say the Phoenix Force is so powerful, because it just represents life. And so in truth, in order for the Phoenix Force to truly be destroyed, you would have to wipe out all things in existence. I mean, literally, just like wipe out the entire of the multiverse with not a single scrap of energy left. Because if there's a single iota of energy, that energy will become space, and then it will become stars, which in turn will form planets, which will grow life, and the Phoenix Force will exist. And so because of that, you'd literally have to wipe out all things in existence, which can't really happen. And so because of that, with the Phoenix Force finally emerging on the moon and making its presence known to Hope Summers, the initial idea is that if it seizes control of her again, it'll send her into a state of chaos, because she's not emotionally ready ready to harness the full power of the Phoenix. Not even Jean Grey was, and she was a full-grown woman. Now, of course, as time progressed with Jean's character, she was able to kind of harness the Phoenix, but she was nowhere near as powerful as she was during the original Phoenix saga. It was more or less like the Phoenix power would just manifest occasionally, but it was reduced in strength by quite a bit. And so with Tony Stark basically attacking this Phoenix, ultimately what it ends up doing is instead of destroying the Phoenix Force, it splits its energy into 5 pieces, which go into Namor the Submariner, Emma Frost, Cyclops, Colossus, and Magic, Illyana Rasputin, a Colossus' little sister. Now, why these particular 5 were chosen, I have not been able to find an interview that gives any real measure of explanation. It's just they were the ones who were just there. I mean, it's just really done for the sake of storytelling. But the cool thing about this is it begs the question of how bad are their motives? Are their motives really that bad in the first place? Because what we end up doing is we actually pick up 10 days after the Phoenix 5 are basically formed, and we travel to the island of Utopia. Now, what the Phoenix 5 have basically done is to use their powers to transform Utopia into this Utopia place. Now, that's kind of the irony of it, is because of the fact that with the namesake of Utopia, when it was originally formed by the X-Men, it was basically a utopia of sorts that was designed to be kind of like a modern-day version of Genosha. And what I mean here, I know we're covering a lot of X-Men history here, so bear with me, but Genosha was basically this place that existed for the purpose of being Magneto's own little home away from home. It was Magneto's place to basically have a location where mutants could be free from human oppression. It was a country that was governed by mutants, that was only for mutants. Now, mutants could live elsewhere in the world if they wanted to, but it was just one of those things where you pay your money and take your chances. You live in New York, folks are going to hate you because you're a mutant. If you live in San Francisco, they're going to hate you because you're a mutant. If you live in Genosha, you're going to live among your own kind. Now, there's a whole backstory in terms of why Magneto got Genosha in the first place and that kind of thing, but Genosha itself was destroyed in the first story arc of Grant Morrison's New X-Men that was basically called E is for Extinction. And so because of that, Genosha was just this wasteland. And so if you read like House of M, or really any of the modern X-Men stories before All New, All Different Marvel, and you basically go and they show you the city of Genosha, that's why it's destroyed. It was just never rebuilt. Instead of rebuilding it during the whole Dark Reign story, Marvel just introduced Utopia, and it was just like Cyclops' version of Genosha, more or less. It was a safe haven for what was left of the X-Men. Now, the fact remains here that Charles Xavier is effectively brought into the equation, and this is one of the most important parts of the story, and the reason why is because of the fact that Cyclops is the first and oldest student of Charles Xavier. Not necessarily in age, but he's the oldest in terms of the people who have been part of Charles Xavier's life the longest. He was the first student. He's the one that really shared so many of Xavier's ideologies. And that's one of the reasons why there were some people loved Avengers vs. X-Men, and there were some that hated Avengers vs. X-Men. Now, we'll get a little more into that discussion once we get into the death of Charles Xavier. But the idea here is that what Cyclops basically says is, your dream of a peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants is exactly what I'm bringing to you. Like, you've always wanted to see humans and mutants existing. You've always wanted to see the world to be basically this giant utopia. That's exactly what we're doing here. Now, the problem with this is that Cyclops is doing this at the edge of a gun. He's doing this with a weapon. He's basically pointing a gun at the heads of everybody and saying, if you don't do what I tell you to, I'm gonna pull the trigger. And so it's not really like a utopia so much as it is just like an enlightened monarch or an enlightened dictatorship. The funny thing about this is that Hope Summers is being kept on the island itself, and Hope's I guess, you know, really her kind of offering to be here is really more of like, hey, you can be here if you want to, but you can leave anytime you want. Now, we're gonna find out it's actually one of those fake scenarios where she's really not allowed to leave. But again, this really just kind of shows the stance of Cyclops, because what he does is he approaches her and says, hey, look, the power of the Phoenix Force is so seductive. You know, if I were to offer it to you, what would be your answer? And of course she says yes. Now, of course, Cyclops yanks away and says, but you're not ready for it. And this is the contradictory nature of his character. With absolute power, or at least as they say, absolute power corrupts absolutely, that's exactly what's going on with Cyclops right now, as well as the other Phoenix 5. They're being overcome by the power they possess. And it makes sense, because it's like a drug. I mean, imagine for example, tomorrow you woke up and realized that you could warp reality. That with enough time, you could train yourself to do that. So you could go to like Best Buy and you could reach into your pocket and have as much money as you needed at that particular point in time. Or you could just not even need money. You could just say, you know what, I want a big 4K TV, and you just manifest it out of thin air. Imagine you had that kind of godlike power. Would you be willing to give it up? Would you be willing to let it go? Of course not. I mean, if you, because you would genuinely believe, well, I can keep it contained, I can keep it controlled, I can keep it from allowing the world to run amok, but you can't see the future. You don't know what's going to happen, and it may very well lead to the destruction of yourself and everything that you hold dear. And that's really what's kind of being played here with regards to Cyclops, is he's losing himself and the power that he possesses. And that's why it's so extreme, that's why it's so intense, is because of the fact that Cyclops himself was, you know, again, the oldest student of Charles Xavier. He followed Charles Xavier's ideologies of a peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants in the extreme. He was the one champion, the one guy that Xavier could always count on to uphold his ideologies. With Cyclops falling so far so fast, it's this idea that he's almost reaching the point that he's beyond hope. Now, he will reach that place. He will reach that level that he's basically beyond any real measure of redemption. But what we end up doing here is we pick up with the Avengers, because again, their goal is to grab Hope Summers, and their goal is to get her out of there, because the stance of Cyclops and the other Phoenix, I guess the other members of the Phoenix Five, is they're going to keep Hope Summers on Utopia. They're going to train her on how to use her powers effectively, so that when the time comes, they will imbue her with the Phoenix Force, and she will become the new Phoenix, and she'll basically be a harbinger of the rebirth of mutants across the Earth. Well, again, from the Avengers' standpoint, it's only a matter of time before she becomes corrupted by that power. And so what they do is they basically initiate a halo jump. Now, halo jumps are kind of cool. They seem kind of interesting. I've never served in the military, so I've never done one before, and I never would. But halo stands for high altitude, low open. And what that means is you usually jump from like 30,000 feet. But the idea is to jump from an extremely high altitude and then open at the very moment before, really before you hit the bottom, relatively speaking, so that no one knows you're there. And that's the idea to pull off here. Now, under normal circumstances, from what I understand, with a halo jump, you usually attach flares to yourself, somewhere on your body, like a foot or a hand or something like that, so people know where you are. But in this instance, they're not doing that, because if they did, anybody in Utopia would look up and say, hey, what are those flares doing falling from the sky? And they would realize the Avengers are coming. And so the funny thing about this is that it's also the Avengers not really underestimating, but just taking their chances as best they can, because Emma Frost is one of the Phoenix Five. She's an Omega level telepath. She's wildly powerful in her telepathic abilities. You know, with the Phoenix powers, she can read the minds of everyone on Earth at the same time without being phased in any form or fashion. And so she knows the Avengers are coming. She knows they're on their way. But something that I want you to notice here is how manipulative she's going to become. That's something I want you to keep in the back of your head, because she's going to become a very significant and violent character. But ultimately, with Cyclops and Emma Frost making their presence, they essentially just kind of show up to confront the Avengers, but then the Avengers are met with the arrival of the Scarlet Witch. Now, this is basically Marvel just kind of reminding us, hey, look, the Scarlet Witch is still pretty powerful, but it's more so fear than it is legitimate power. The Scarlet Witch is more powerful as herself. She's more powerful than any one member of the Phoenix Five. But the Phoenix Five are terrified of the Scarlet Witch, because remember, she's the one that said no more mutants and stripped everybody of their powers. And so from their perspective, she's terrifying. You know, her power is extreme. If she could warp reality in such a degree that she could just remove mutant powers from everyone, then what could she do against the Phoenix? Now, the important thing to keep in mind here is that the Scarlet Witch has been reduced in power. She's not House of M powerful anymore. That was a moment in time. That was it. That was the absolute peak and height of her powers. At this point, she's still pretty strong in terms of what she can do, but against the entirety of the Phoenix Force combined into one, she doesn't stand a chance. Like, she's just not that powerful. You know, really no one is. And so what we end up doing here is, of course, with the Scarlet Witch effectively whisking Hope Summers away and allying herself with the Avengers, what this does is it begins drawing lines in the sand. And this is Marvel effectively prepping the second part of the story, which is when a lot of the X-Men begin to defect away from the Phoenix Five because of the aggressive and the intense actions that they begin to take towards the globe and everybody in it as a whole. But with that being said, guys, we are going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.
Yeah, guys, we're getting there with the picture. Hopefully you are enjoying it in the background. I love listening to this when I draw. Yeah, I've got quite a bit done now, and I'm just trying to do a little bit more. I might end the stream in a moment or two and come back tomorrow, as this is quite a long recording to upload. So if you have enjoyed this, guys, don't forget to leave a like. And
if you guys enjoy my content, make sure you
that's Comics Explained. If you do like what I'm putting out, guys, again, same as Rob's saying there, don't forget to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. My name is Blut084, BLUT084, Art and Games. I am here every single day on YouTube, occasionally on Mixer, but every day and night over on Instagram. But like I was saying to you guys, I've got the main picture done. So let's just remove all of those layers that I've put in there, just so you get to see what we started with. And yeah, this is what we started, and we've done the parrot. We've obviously got the main character, which is called Turk, or turkbird. It is the combination of a turtle with a monkey and a parrot. Which is a bird. Yeah, put in the tree, put in the background, and tomorrow, or maybe this afternoon, depending on what I get time to do, I will do this one here and get it done. But over the next couple of days, as it's Thursday today and Friday is tomorrow, you probably will get 2 videos tomorrow, guys. One in the morning and one in the evening. So, or one in the afternoon and one in the evening on Friday for the art, as I'll do 2 videos if I do not get this finished. I don't think it's going to take me much more to get all of this put down, as we've already done the background myself, and we've already done a few different details for the bird, for the monkey and for the turtle. And yeah, we've pretty much done the animals for as far as I would want to take them, because I'm not going into any great detail. I'm just sort of digitizing what I've already drew, because I don't want to change too much of it. But if I need to, I will obviously try shaping it up. And if I was to do a decent crack at it, where it's like this is the first time back, and it's just like almost practice again, if you like, to draw. I like that parrot. I don't know about you guys. Again, this was a dedication from Vudo or YT or TY on Instagram. Thank you again for doing that, and hopefully if you see this video you will leave a like. Tell me where you've gotten up to, and would you like the print yourself, guys? If you would like this when it's finished, as something just to have on your on your computer, or as a phone background, or even a tablet background, or wherever you have a device that you can put background on. You can also put these on the back of your PlayStation. If you guys would like a picture for your device as a background, don't forget you can let me know here on the bottom of the video, or if you want to come over to the Instagram. And my name is Blut084, BLUT084. Art and Games. Again, if you want to own anything, or if you want a particular picture drawn for yourself, all you got to do is leave me a comment either here or over on Instagram. Otherwise, guys, I will be back tomorrow to finish this off, so don't forget to hit subscribe, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye bye for now.